Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Simon Reynolds and Dean Wareham.
Hello.
Hi there. Thank you for coming.
It's nice to see you, Simon. Simon, you interviewed me about 25 years ago.
Yes.
For Melody. What was it for?
Melody Maker.
It was for Melody Maker.
That's right, yeah.
Thank you for doing that. It was, and we took the photo where at your apartment, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Somewhere.
Next to the radiator in our apartment, our tiny East Village apartment. In 1990, wasn't it, I think?
That sounds right.
Or 89.
I was. There was Paul Simon was interviewed a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, by the BBC, and they asked him about David Bowie's passing, and he said David Bowie spent more time thinking about what he would look like or what character he would inhabit than he did thinking about the song. And a lot of people got mad at him on Facebook. But do you think would David Bowie actually object to that characterization, or is it inaccurate?
I think he'd probably run with it. He'd probably make hay with it and say that all those things are just as important as the music. And Lady Gaga, in fact, went the next step and said that the music was just a distraction from her visual presentation and her videos. So she sort of took it to the next step of sort of attacking, turning around the rockish sort of substance is more important than all the other stuff.
And what do you call her in the book? The fame monster?
Oh, that's what she called herself.
Oh, she calls herself that?
Yeah.
All right,
yeah,
then.
no. That's what
So
I
you've
thought
not
was interesting
insulted her
about
at
her, that she kind of identified the desire for fame as this sort of monstrous urge. And I think she's really quite an interesting thinker in that sense, much more than she is a musician, really. But I think, one of the things with... it's Paul Simon you said that,
yes.
Right? Yeah. Paul Simon does not pay a lot of attention to appearance, clothing.
It's not really fair,
visuals,
is it?
The whole thing. So he's making a virtue of
yes,
it's unavoidable there. I think one of the things my book starts with me talking about Top of the Pops, this English show, which is where I sort of encountered glam and really pop music altogether. Apart from the Beatles, who I'd probably seeped out into the everyday life, and I picked up as like a 6-year-old. It was an audiovisual experience right at the start, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. This
it seems
book
like the book
is that pop music is, it's never pop music has never been just about the music. It's always been about image. It's been about stage gestures and movements, the performance aspect, clothes. It's also been, what people say in interviews. It's like a great blurry mess of ideas and concepts and visual stuff and packaging and hype. All these things are part of pop music. And music has always been, a crucial component, maybe the indispensable component, but it's not the only thing that people are excited about or that you can think about. And so, with this book, it's quite a departure for me in a way, because I'm paying attention to these things more than I've done before.
Yeah, it seems like it's as much about fashion as it is about music.
Well, it's also about, I was thinking the other day, my early writing, the people I interviewed when I wrote up the interview would appear as these sort of disembodied minds, like they live in this kind of cloud of sound and concepts. And in this book, I've actually done more like describing how people look. I actually had to write about Mark Bolan's smile. it's a crucial part of the appeal of T-Rex. Is not just the records; it's this amazing smile that Mark Bolan had. This sort of kind of weird, twinkling, magical smile that he had, that sort of was part of how he bewitched his audiences and how he charmed everyone, and he knew its power, but that didn't prevent him from that didn't make him self-conscious about it. He just unleashed it,
Right.
in the course of his conquering of the world. And then, so I'm also talking about, bodies and stage moves and things like that are sort of, that are kind of a new area for me to talk about,
right,
in a way. Because I've tended to write about sort of more underground music or, with rave music, it actually was like virtually the visual side of it, apart from the lights and things.
It was non-existent.
Well, a lot of those people, you never even saw their photograph.
Right.
The techno people. Whereas with glam, it's all about people's faces and their clothes.
Right. You have a quote from Bolan Mark Bolan. He says, 95% of my success is the way I look.
Yeah.
And the music is secondary. I mean, he admits you do have to have good music, but initially it's got nothing to do with music.
I mean, I think that's a slight overstatement. There are loads of examples of groups where it's all the image and there's nothing.
No, to get played on the
with.
radio,
Yeah,
you have to have something more than the look, obviously.
But it's definitely like it's almost like a 50-50 thing, I think. That's why I stress this sort of audio-visual aspect.
Right.
But I think it's actually part of the appeal of all kinds of music. There's something about... I think the way indie bands look is part of their sort of the connection made with their audience. I think it's with all music. Something about the way Husker Du looked actually kind of meant something to their fans. It was like a protest against pop in a way, wasn't it?
Yes.
And the Replacements did a video where you can only see a hand. In the
you
whole
just
thing.
see the hand putting the record on there.
That they don't even appear in the video at all.
Right.
So that's there's some kind of visual rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, if I think back to like the years Galaxy 500 first started out, we were like deeply suspicious of like bands, say like the Godfathers, because they all wore suits. Like those guys were, and you weren't really you weren't supposed to dress up in indie bands, and also maybe it's an American thing as against an English thing that American males don't generally peacock as much.
Well, I think
not white
it
ones.
It depends on the scene. It depends on the class, I think Saturday Night Fever. I mean, if you think of that, that's quite peacocky. That's quite
true.
Sort of flashy.
Yeah.
Dressed. So, it depends. But certainly in the indie alternative tradition, there's less emphasis on sartorial splendor.
Yeah. No, you weren't allowed to. No, you look at all the bands from the '90s, from Pavement to and then the grunge era too, where it's just hideous, bad clothes. Mm-hmm. There weren't any nice jeans to buy like there are today. But you start out the book with what came before glam, the unglam.
Right. Yes. Well, the immediate. The reason why glam sort of works as a gesture and why it had some sort of edge, I guess, or some kind of feeling it's the new thing in the early 70s was that it was preceded by this period when rock got very kind of dressed down, very sort of grown up as well in its orientation. It was a time when all the musicians who'd been pop stars in the early 60s, early to mid 60s, they all grew beards. They all, a lot of them were getting, settling down, or at least heading into a phase of life when their concerns were not sort of teenage concerns, and writing these, serious grown-up albums, and losing interest in the art of the pop single, and just not really moving around much on stage. So the sort of totemic records of that period would have been the first two albums by the band, Blind Faith, Allman Brothers, who had so little interest in the art of the single that one of their tracks starts on side one of an album and then continues on side two.
Right.
And so the single sales in Britain actually really plummeted in 1970. I think it only took like about 100,000 single sales to get in the top 10. It just was not where the energy of the culture was at, and there was this thing in the UK they call it the underground. Basically it was like progressive rock, hippie rock, country rock. Same in this country. It was FM radio music, and there was a college circuit in both countries, but particularly in the UK, it was all the college entertainment secretaries had all this money to play with, because all the students had to pay their dues to the National Union of Students, so they could book all these bands. It became this thing. It was like bands like Soft Machine, all these sort of, actually some of them very interesting groups that I like, but it was not pop music. It was not it had no showbiz element at all. It was very sort of, people performed on stage in this very kind of inward focused way, like soloing away these long solos, jamming, and yes, not many great pop singles. And Glam kind of reversed that. It was sort of very much about looking good, being entertaining on stage, and this drastic reorientation back to the 7-inch single. And so within about a year of T-Rex and Slade and the Sweet taking off, to get in the top 10, it took 500,000 single sales, like 5 times as many. So singles became like the centre of the scene. And the other thing was, it was a return to sort of music, rock and roll that you could dance to. All the groups of the Glam were, whether it was Bolan with these sort of kind of boogies, these groovy little songs like Bang a Gong, or it was Slade with their very sort of stomping, strident beat, the Sweet with their amazingly sort of produced, really powerful drum sounds on tracks like Ballroom Blitz. Really, across the board, it was all music. It was rock and roll to dance to. It was rock and roll to scream to, because it had these sort of cute front men. And it was
which
something
helps
to
magazines too, right?
And there was a boom of teenage magazines. So it was a return of teen power, really, as a consumer force in pop music. And that's why the Sweet did this song Teenage Rampage, which was kind of like a sort of tribute to the demographic consumer might that had been flexed by the teenagers who had this sort of pent up consumer demand for sort of pop music.
Right. For fun. Now, you also mentioned that Glam is a movement that grows out of a period of defeat and disillusionment, in a way, coming after, say, the hippie era of hope and social action. That instead, with the Glam era, there's a retreat into a personal quest for stardom. The orientation of the underground, was much more collective, and it was trying to sort of change things on a mass level. And then what happens is that people who actually participated in the counterculture, including Bolan and Bowie, sort of really they spent a good couple of years in the late 60s mouthing a lot of the pieties of the hippie culture, and Bolan would say things like, "I'm not really interested in singles, and I don't really want to do interviews, and I'm not interested in publicity." And within a couple of years, he's got like 7 or 8 number 1 singles under his belt. He's doing every interview he possibly can, and basically they decide to sort of break for stardom, Right. And I think I don't know how much Mark Bolan and David Bowie ever really sort of believed in the counterculture, whether they just thought it was like a sort of what people were doing,
where it was the forum or the arena in which to sort of make a name for themselves. And,
right.
But Bolan in Tyrannosaurus Rex is the precursor to T-Rex, was very much like going along with what was hot, like the Incredible String Band. He was like, playing an acoustic guitar, sitting cross-legged on stage, singing about elves and fairies and stuff like that, kind of, genuine interests of his. I think he was a big fan of Tolkien, but, very much like, no, I'm not interested in being a star.
And then when it comes to T-Rex, all of a sudden he's writing about motor cars and stuff, right?
It's still a bit kind of fairy magical, mystical stuff, but he's writing, he's singing about, like, I drive a Rolls Royce because it's good for my voice.
Yes.
Very much sort of inventing bling,
right.
sort of, decades in advance. It's one of the things with glam is that it's, it reflects a desire for stardom, but also stardom and fame become like one of its main subjects. There's a lot of songs about being in a band, wanting to be a star, or even the costs of fame and stardom, like with Fame by David Bowie.
I think people in the States, Mark Bolan is sort of a marginal figure. He's not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Is he not?
Which is incredible.
Yeah, that's shocking, isn't it?
I mean, neither is Slade or The Sweet or Roxy Music, a lot of the bands that you talk about.
Even Roxy,
yes.
Oh, right.
I mean, it's focused on American artists, maybe. But people don't realize how huge T-Rex were. I remember Tony Visconti saying this to me. It's like I made far more money off of the T-Rex records, because he signed them as well, I guess. But then I did off of David Bowie. David Bowie was a cult artist by comparison.
Yeah, I mean, T-Rex were massive, but they were, the people. One journalist coined this term T-Rextasy, which was, very much like a play on Beatlemania, and that was how it was perceived at the time in newspapers and the music press. And in the record industry, there was a huge sort of sigh of relief, because people were waiting for something on that scale to happen. They wanted that kind of hysteria. There was a concern that all these long, very serious albums that you're supposed to sit down to and listen to very seriously, that was would lose younger listeners, and they would just drift off into some other form of hobby or leisure activity altogether. So there was a feeling in the record industry, we need some mass teen sensation, and T-Rex sort of supplied it and caused like genuine hysteria at gigs. People badly injuring themselves and falling off balconies because they were screaming so hard and that kind of thing. And what was interesting about T-Rextasy and its relation to Beatlemania was that Ringo Starr actually became friends with Bolan and
made a documentary,
made this film Born to Boogie, which is a sort of half electrifying concert footage and then half really embarrassing sort of interludes in the style of Magical Mystery Tour, so like these sort of sub-psychedelic whimsical comedy scenes. But Ringo Starr directed it. I believe it's his only film he directed. But he, there was much commented on the fact that he would be filming this footage at these huge concerts, in the I guess the pit at the bottom of the stage with his film crew, and be surrounded by these people, these teenagers screaming, who just completely paid no attention to Ringo Starr. He was already history.
They didn't know who
he was already, So for Ringo, I think it was interesting because he was observing Beatlemania from the outside, as it were. He was witnessing what it was like up close, but sort of from the outside, which he'd obviously never done, having lived it from the inside. It's just a shame that the movie is so diabolical. It's worth watching if you could just watch the concert bits, because they are amazing. And what's interesting about them is that compared to modern pop music, it isn't that glitzy or razzle-dazzly. It's really, Bolan just has like a bit of glitter on his cheekbones and like a little purple scarf. But that is enough to sort of differentiate T-Rex from all the drab boogie bands and country rock and singer-songwriter types before. It was that tiny bit of sparkle that kind of was enough. He also wore women's shoes as well. He had very small feet, and he used to get women's shoes from Davidays of Oxford Street in London. But there was these little tiny touches, these feminizing dandy touches that were enough to trigger sort of this mass team.
You mentioned in the book that musically T-Rex sounds like it's inspired by the 50s, but if the 50s had come after the 60s.
Right, yeah. Well, I think actually generally with glam, I've been asked a few times to define it, and one thing is the look, with this sort of that's where it achieves coherence as a movement or a scene is the look, this sort of ridiculously overstated version of glamour, and very much like, it's not glamour in the conventional Hollywood sense. They're not, the glam stars weren't glamorous in the way, say, Diana Ross was at that time,
right,
or a movie idol. It was very much like an absurdist, almost a parody of glamour, I think, or like certainly a cartoon overstated version of it. And the other thing is the sound, which is very much like a reversion to the simpler sort of structures of 50s rock and roll, and maybe some 60s groups like the Dave Clark Five, Beats and Pieces, or
the records. The records still sound great today. They sound modern. They don't sound dated at all. So they sound less dated than, say, the late 60s, or Buddy Holly, or then like hippie music.
Well, that's the other thing, is they reverting to these simpler structures and this sort of direct attack and riffs and big hooks, away from the hippie, mushy, convoluted sounds of prog rock. But they've taken on all the kind of production advances of the late 60s and the early 70s. So the drums sound huge. The guitars are all kind of stacked. The guitar parts are all kind of stacked, and there's a kind of burnish and a polish to the production that's very sort of state of the art then, and still sounds great, as you say.
Yeah, I think if you look at the 70s, even if it's music you don't like, even if it's songs you don't like, the recording techniques were great. It's kind of like the peak of it in a way.
Of analog recording?
Yes, of analog recording. You've got like 16-track 1-inch tape, which is probably the best format ever.
Yeah.
They moved away. And then, because then when you move into the 80s and all of a sudden sounds become unnatural and is sometimes even hard for us to listen to now. But
right. What you mean with gated drums and
yes.
stuff?
Whereas even if you listen to like a single by, Bread now, it's you're like, oh, that's a beautifully recorded acoustic guitar.
Well, being a musician and a guitarist, you probably have, what would you say would define glam as a musical style? Is there something there?
Well, I think it's different for each of these artists, but I mean, Bolan certainly had a great guitar sound.
Yeah.
I mentioned to you there are certain like distinctive pedals that were starting to be used right then. These treble boosters. The amps weren't really distorting they weren't loud enough on their own, so they were using these treble boosters that Ronson used, or Tony Iommi, or Roger Waters, all of them, which then disappeared again in the mid-70s when something else came along. But you pick up, a German company started reissuing these pedals a few years ago, and you plug into one of them, and you're like, oh, that's the sound right there.
It's to me, not being a musician at all, or only having held a guitar a couple of times in my life, and deciding it wasn't the path for me. It seems like it's a very clear sound, almost like a lot of these records you can almost see them. They're so well produced.
Yes.
And, like Mick Ronson's guitar just sounds. It almost sounds as stylized as Bowie's vocals are in a way.
Right. It's a very specific thing, and he specifically uses a treble booster and like a wah pedal that he's switched on, but then like left it in a fixed position to really like nail this sound. Which, as you point out, it's neither clean nor distorted. It's
somewhere in between.
Sweet. Obviously, the central figure in the book is David Bowie.
Yeah.
Through his many eras, and you mentioned he comes out of the era of the rock band that the Kinks, the Stones, the Who, all of those. But he's a solo artist, which enables him to go forward very differently.
Yeah, that seemed very striking to me, that Bowie, he's in various groups, but he kind of leaves them very quickly. He's very, one of the things that defines the 60s and what you might call the British rock achievement is these groups where they're quite like stable structures, of all, the Who, the Stones, Beatles, Pink Floyd,
right?
Virtually Yardbirds. Virtually all of them are pretty stable structures. Various members drop out through madness or drugs.
You can replace elements,
but they're like families with emotional discords going on in them that sort of fuel it somehow. But they also have musical relationships that grow, and that's the basis on which they evolve and do such amazing things. Bowie didn't ever really join a group as such until the Tin Machine.
Right.
So that was his attempt to be a rock band.
Right.
Everything else is he's the boss and he's got accomplices, and he was very good at picking accomplices or foils, but he's in it for himself really in a way. There isn't that gang thing really, that is one of the things with your rock band.
Yes. No, and when he did it with Tin Machine, it seemed kind of absurd.
And it's particularly striking. Like he's been in various sort of mod type groups, and then he gets with them all, and he does this record. It's 1967, right? So if you think of 1967, you think of what happened in 1967: Pipe at the Gates of Dawn, Sgt. Pepper's, The Doors, the
Banana
first
album.
second Jefferson Airplane album. I mean, it's the golden age of the rock album. Rock is becoming this monster world force, and he puts out an album of sort of comedy songs and strange little musical character stuff, which is immensely charming. Actually, it's one of my favourite of his albums, but it's so out of step with what's going on. He gets rid of his previous band. One guy survives to sort of work on the arrangements and stuff, but it's basically like this sort of Anthony Newley type record. It's much more like something to do with music hall or musical theatre or
right.
Comedy pop. There's this British tradition of comedy pop that it almost fits into, where he's playing characters in every song. So
he's not a rock singer. Also, you mentioned that.
Yeah.
I think I just saw a documentary on the plane, that 5 years thing, where someone's asking him, says, "Oh, you're a rock singer." He's like, "Oh, no. That's where you made it. That's your mistake. I'm not a rock singer."
Well,
he went on to play one.
He was very actually quite sniffy about that and quite dismissive of it. Almost, and I think that's one of the reasons why quite a few American rock critics were very suspicious of him in the 70s, because he was kind of like making light of rock or not. He didn't have the commitment to it that they wanted. Was expected on the part of American rock fans and rock critics who thought it was the most important thing in the world, And he seemed to be making it's just something I'm doing for a bit, but then I'll do something else, And they felt that was dilettantish. And it's interesting, it's quite interesting to look at how he was received, because now he's such a sort of canonical figure and a global treasure. But he was received with a great deal of suspicion by a lot of critics. In the early 70s. Lester Bangs was very disparaging.
You mentioned that story that Ellen Willis goes over to see him and Lou Reed and Iggy Pop, and she's like, well, Lou and Iggy are like real, but Bowie to me is not real.
Yeah. And that's actually a common, what's the word? I want to say antimony, an opposition, like a pairing, a conceptual pairing. Iggy, the real thing, Bowie, the unreal thing.
Right.
Iggy doing this incredibly physical performances that involve really testing and stretching his body to the limits, and that being a kind of natural theatre, which is actually what Bowie called it, natural theatre, or street theatre, Detroit theatre. And then Bowie being much more like, he studied mime, he
had a background in advertising.
He'd wanted to do musicals, he wanted to do cabaret, all this kind of stuff, which is a little Iggy was not like a complete feral kind of delinquent being. He was actually a very intelligent guy, read Nietzsche, and actually went to college for longer than Bowie never went to college, whereas Iggy actually went to college for about 1 year, I think. So it wasn't like he was this instinctual half man, half Neanderthal on stage. It was an act that he was doing. But yes, it did seem to have more obvious commitment and wildness than what Bowie
But
was doing.
I mean, even
Bowie's playing a role much more.
Right.
Like Iggy kind of tried to live out the persona.
But despite that, you can go back and pick, even on the early records, a song like "Letter to Hermione." Is that how you say her name? I think, which is there's a demo of this floating around YouTube too, which is like a beautiful song that is, and it's heartfelt and it's quite sincere.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Kooks is
drew on
another
his
one.
real- he drew on his real emotions more than his rhetoric, which was always that I'm playing a role.
Right.
Things that he actually cared about crept into the songs fairly regularly. But there was a lot of, I think he felt like these roles could be a way of sort of moving around a lot from, not to be trapped in a sort of persona. Because the thing about rock performers is they often get stuck with the identity they form, don't they? And then it's hard to sort of, the cycles of fashion mean you're disposed of. And so I think that was his strategy in a way, was to outwit that process by becoming the new thing constantly.
Which must have been draining in the long term, sense, perhaps. But that's, I mean, obviously, Bowie played guitar, saxophone, taught himself to play piano well at one point, but maybe you could argue that his chief instrument is the media, right?
Yeah. I mean, he was a consummate user of publicity. That's something that kind of is evident right from the start. Very, very early in his career, he did this really kind of hilarious thing where someone from the BBC was looking to do an item on a news program about the problems of having long hair, which was a new thing.
Yes.
And there were hair that now would be nothing was considered like a couple of inches onto your shoulder was considered like really subversive and gender bending. And he this BBC reporter approached him in a cafe, and Bowie just dreamt up this idea of I forget the exact name of it, but something like this: the League for Protection of. But so he appears on TV with this completely non-existent organisation, this Society for the Protection of Long-Haired Men, and rides this kind of thing for quite a while. And I'm not sure if the BBC were kind of sort of half knew that it was all bullshit and just thought it was a good story, but there was a protest about some pop program where they supposedly they would have to cut their hair. Him and his band would have to cut their hair if they wanted to appear on it. So there was like a little demo with placards outside the BBC, and they sort of tried to spin it out for quite a while. So that's like 1964, I think. And other things that he sort of, he in a way he kind of tried to sort of make publicity hay out of the sort of arts lab movement that he was involved in, which is this sort of experimental art centres, very big in the counterculture. Right. He became the public representative of the one that he started in South London, and then the famous "I'm gay" statement.
I'm gay and always have been. Is what he said.
Seems to have been quite an exaggeration.
He was gay culturally, you said.
Yeah, it was very well timed and very well sort of placed in terms of he gave it to what was then the biggest music paper, Melody Maker,
right,
and made a big splash with it. And it, the quote travelled far and wide, and it was picked up by newspapers and other music papers and sort of non-music newspapers as well, and really kind of kick-started his whole career in terms of becoming a figure that people talked about and discussed as if he was like a zeitgeist figure, sort of representing some new sensibility of the 70s.
So, I get a sense that both he and Mark Bolan are just expert at stringing the media along. And also the big difference between England and the United States is you had this weekly music press that they got to fill the pages every week. There was never anything like that here, I don't think.
I think the Rolling Stone came out every 2 weeks.
Right.
That was about as close as it got. And you had local, weekly papers, but it was a lot more diffuse. There was something about the centralising function of the British music press. There were 4 music papers came out every week. And such a hothouse kind of competition between the papers to get stories. And so it was when Mark Bowen blew up, it was just like every week the papers had to have a story on him. They even did a feature on his publicist, B.P. Fallon, who was a really interesting dude. He was like a real charismatic guy who'd I think he'd been involved in the whole bedpiece thing that John Lennon and Yoko Ono had done. But it was like just constant coverage of these people, and Bolan was very much like the king of the bullshit.
Right.
Flow. He had a constant stream of things he was supposedly doing, like he was going to make a movie with Fellini. There was going to be
he would just make this stuff
despite
up.
having only had a top 10 hit with Bang A Gone, Get It On in the US, he talked about how there was going to be a 36 episode cartoon series of him in the States in the style of the Jackson 5 cartoon. He would just come out, he had written 6 science fiction novels. He would just invent this bullshit, and none of these things ever transpired. But it was part of I think he kind of genuinely in the moment thought he was going to be doing these things, or the desire to do them was almost as good as the reality of doing them.
Right.
But these were great sort of copy generating machines, as was Roxy Music and Eno. They were very much loved by journalists, and journalists kind of were complicit or in cahoots in presenting this image of Roxy Music. They always talked about how the band was staying in the image of Roxy was this group who were living this life of chic and elegance and this fabulous dream world of sort of aesthete aristocratic existence. So the stories always were like, the interview always took place like in a 4-star hotel.
Right.
Champagne was being poured, and then it became like this cult figure where a lot of the problems in Roxy Music were that Eno was being interviewed separately and just giving these great quotes about all these wacky theories. Brian Ferry said, one of the reasons Eno had to go was that he was tired of picking up the music papers and there was Eno being interviewed,
right?
As a key member of Roxy Music, but talking about recording the sound of earthworms or something like that, or sort of typical Eno projects and fanciful things. Nothing to do with what this couldn't have been further from what Brian Ferry agenda was, which was to be like the Noel Coward of the 1970s.
You mentioned Eno's outfits. He's got these things like jumpsuits with frilly things up here, and he said that he's part of the reason he had those is because he's just standing there playing the keyboard, going like this. So he's like, I need things to accentuate like each move that I'm doing.
Yeah, there was very, very minimal gestures involved in his EMS Cynthia.
But that's why you put a mask on stage too, I suppose.
He had his girlfriend then was an artist called Carol Nichol, I think, and she would help him make these costumes. They're actually kind of similar to the costumes Gary Glitter wore, which were like sort of virtually had to be thrown away after one use kind of costumes.
Right.
But Brian also had, also had elements like the feathers were, an important thing. These sort of plumes of feathers that were like kind of references. That's why I sort of differentiate glam from glam and glamour as we conventionally understand it in the sort of movie star to Kardashian's sense of glamour, because it had things like the feathers. You'd have these sort of feathers that are very much like a reference to 1930s Hollywood glamour. To Marlene Dietrich would wear dresses that were basically made of the plumage of 140 birds who'd died for her splendor. Or Brian Ferry would wear these, tiger or leopard patch fur elements, but it was done in a way that wasn't just a straightforward duplication of Hollywood. It was sort of like a mishmash. Ferry would have the quiff, the rockabilly quiff, sort of mishmash with this Hollywood elements, and it was. So yeah, glam. I think of it as like an absurdist travesty of glamour as much as a straightforward attempt to be glamorous. I mean, and even Bowie kind of looks pretty wacky, doesn't he? In some of these garments he's wearing, they're not. It's not Cary Grant. It's not.
No, it's closer to what Elvis was wearing.
Yeah,
but you mentioned Brian Ferry. You seem to be turned off at the point at which he starts wearing a white tuxedo jacket, and it seems like Brian Ferry kind of turned into that what started as something ironic became I don't know, later in life is what he kind of turned into. You say he's the first rock star to join the aristocracy.
Yeah, I mean, I think he always, he came from a very extremely working class background in the north of England. His dad was initially a farm labourer, and then he worked in coal mines as the guy who looked after the pit ponies. So he's going to the bowels of the earth with these poor animals. They lived in, they were quite poor. They had an outside toilet, and they had to use chopped up newspaper as toilet paper. I mean, this is Ferry's background. So for him, the fantasy of leaving that behind for this world of chic and elegance and aesthetic, perfect design and perfect clothing and perfect girlfriends, it was just like, a very deep, potent desire. And he loved Hollywood and going to the movies, the picture palaces, precisely because of this fantasy escape from his origins and his surroundings.
Right.
And so it is, the imagery of aristocracy and of the fine things of life and elegance and all these things in Roxy. It is ironic, but I think there's a real deep desire for it on Brian Ferry's part. He really wants to join the aristocracy for real. And so there are lines in the Roxy songs like he says something like old money's better than new, which seems very witty and clever when you hear it on the first, I can't remember if it's the first or second album, but he actually thought that was true. Old money is better than new, and he ended up marrying someone from the British upper class, putting their children down for Eton, the top private school in the country, and raising these boys who grew up to be sort of virulent defenders of fox hunting.
Yeah. And
one of them actually disrupted the House of Commons to protest because the Labour government, wanted to abolish fox hunting, and he came in and disrupted parliamentary proceedings. And they're nicknamed the Feral Ferries.
Right.
These boys, Otis and I can't remember the name of them. Isaac, I think, is the other one. Named after soul singers, I think. Otis.
Oh, really?
Isaac, yeah. Which is a nice touch. I think the turning point, as you say, is when he puts on the white tuxedo on the cover of Another Time, Another Place, the second solo album of cover songs, and that seems to be sort of when. So the first two or three Roxy albums, the look is quite, as I say, quite absurdist, cartoon, throwing all these things together. But then gradually he starts dressing more in these sort of masculine archetypes. Like he's got a GI look. He's got there's one bit look where it's a tad Nazi, to be honest.
Yeah.
There's a sort of big gold eagle behind the stage, and he's got a little bit of a Hitler part in his hair, and I think he has jodhpurs on, and I don't know if he has a whip, but there's a gaucho look as well, which he was very mocked by. The
Let's Stick Together. He's got that. That was my first experience.
And then he has the tuxedo, and he's by the swimming pool with the cigarette, and that seems to be the point at which he does sort of almost unironically collapse into this what he becomes for the rest of his life. It's this debonair, he's very debonair, he's crooning, a lot of the weirdness of his voice on those early records goes. It's much smoothed out.
Yeah, it's amazing to
isn't
watch like those early videos of him, and there's something just about his facial expression that he's playing a role. Obviously, again, he's sort of not just a rock singer. He's like,
yeah.
And you come back to him late in the book. You come back to Avalon,
which
you said is. Literally the sound of money, which I think is a great description of that record, because it's a beautiful record. It's a fantastic record, but it is so like you put that on, it's just like yes.
It's a bit of I think it's a gorgeous record. I mean, it's like and a lot of people seem to particularly love that record. It's the production, mixing,
Bob Mountain,
but it is, if you compare it to the first couple of Roxy albums, where it's so jagged, it's so weird, the mishmash of different influences, and these players who are all free to express themselves.
Avalon's like the band are not even there.
Yeah, poor old Andy Mackay and Phil Manzanera are just kind of like reduced to the level of session musicians. And then the next album, the first solo album by Brian Ferry, he dispenses with them. And it's a bit sad, but it is a great record. More than this, Avalon's gorgeous. I mean, my own feeling about it was that he was trying to sort of show to Eno that he could do ambient music. He could beat on land, and music for airports at its own game.
Right. The other thing I was watching today was some Gary Glitter videos. I'm wondering if there should be a trigger warning. I'm going to talk about Gary Glitter now. I learned in your book the other names he was considering: Terry Tinsel, Stanley Sparkle, Horace Hydrogen. Before he said it on Gary Glitter.
The name really came about. He was hanging out with these showbiz pals. He'd been involved on a big TV show in the 60s called Ready Steady Go. He was like the warm-up guy. So he's friends with all these music biz, TV world people. They were all shooting the shit and having a laugh at what would be the most ridiculous name for a pop star. And they were kind of thinking back to this phase in the late 50s when rock and roll first arrived in Britain, and you have these Svengalis. There was this guy called Larry Parnes who had all these people and gave them names like Billy Fury, Vince Eager, Duff Power or Duffy Power. I mean, Marty Wilde. They all had these sort of cartoon names, not their real names. They all called names like Reginald Reginald, right? Not Reginald Dwight. That's Elton, but that kind of name. Humdrum names, and so they were given these cartoon sort of persona names, and so that was what they were sort of having fun with, that idea. And Gary Glitter is actually the most sensible of all those names, really. Or at least it feels like that, doesn't it?
Yes.
Much better than Terry Tinsel. And that sort of stuck as his nickname for about a couple of years before he actually became Gary Glitter, the artist, the persona. And what the record that he became that with is called Rock and Roll. And it's sort of harking back to, the 50s, but it's also like a radically brutal reinvention of
it's like an early use of looping, almost proto sampling. That's one of my favorite passages in the book. You talk about the making of that song.
Yeah, I mean, it was a record that
which starts with an accident. It starts with David Essex not showing up to the session, just like say Rock Your Baby started with Gwen McRae not showing up to a session, really? And instead George McRae sings this.
Yeah, he didn't. He was supposed to come in and make a track with Mike Leander, the producer, and he couldn't make it. And so Gary Glitter happened to be hanging around, so they said, let's go in and try and finally, he'd been struggling for over a decade to be a pop star, and let's finally see what we can come up with. And the record was, Rock and Roll Part 1 and 2 is entirely a studio construction. Every instrument on it is played by Mike Leander, and he drummed and then looped the drums and overlaid hand claps and like 30 hand claps, 30 tracks of hand claps, something like that, or maybe 16. It was a lot anyway. And layered the guitars, did all these kind of weird engineering effects, and created this thing that was really a studio construction. And although it references rock and has guitar and he's pounding drums. It's much more like a disco record in a lot of ways, and actually was a success in the discos. That's how it became a hit. It built very gradually. Didn't get any radio play.
Disco in the European sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
talk about that too.
Yeah, it's like in the early 70s. In the 60s, discos have been like a thing, like that scene in every 60s movie where you have the people jiving, looking very elegant and cool. And like there was like a few in London, a few in Paris, a couple in New York. But by the early 70s, they had spread to be in every sort of decent-sized town in the UK. And they were really where a lot of records broke. But at that time, it was before disco as we understand it, like, black music, before Van McCoy and before Gloria Gaynor and that stuff. This was like, glam records, basically, stomping, very drum-heavy records by The Sweet and Gary Glitter and Suzi Quatro and all those groups that people talked about them as being disco hits.
So people going to these instead of going to see some local band play.
Yeah. In the 60s, if you wanted to say, if you're having a party, a wedding or something, you get a band, and the band would play the top 40. But by the early 70s, you had the discos like as places to go, but also you had mobile discos had replaced bands for weddings, pub functions, sports events. So there was actually a new kind of market had emerged, or a new field in which you could break records, and that's what Gary Glitter's record company, Bell Records, did with rock and roll. Part 1 and Part 2, they broke it in the clubs. So it's
You said it didn't get any radio play until this demand from kids hearing it in clubs.
Yeah.
You mentioned that people wrongly assumed that Gary Glitter was gay. When I was a kid living in Australia, there was this Australian comedian, Norman Gunston, if you know who that is.
No, I don't know.
He's sort of like Ali G. It's like he put on this character. He claimed he was from Wollongong, and he's just like a complete idiot that interviews celebrities, and they don't know what the hell to make of him because he's playing this. Anyway, I remember this as a kid. He's asking Gary Glitter, when you were little, did you dress up in your mum's clothes? And Gary Glitter just looks at him and says, have you ever been sued? Anyway, he's in jail now.
Yes.
Right? Should we open this up to any questions, maybe?
Let's do that.
Talking a while, haven't we? There's one back there.
This is in reference to one of your earlier books, Start Again, and also the interviews that went with it, which, by the way, were some of my favorite books of all time.
Oh, thank you.
Certainly life-changing. You repeatedly reference, especially in the post-punk era, that there were certain people, Ian McCullough from Echo and the Bunnymen, for example, who saw people like David Bowie on television and said, that's it, that's what I want to be, that's how I want to move on in this world. It seems like the musical landscape in the last 40 years have changed so much that rock music doesn't have the same sort of ability to catch young people, for people to have it, to see something like that. For me, growing up in New York, in the 90s and 2000s, for me it was hip hop. Those are the people who's like, oh man, I'm gonna freak it like that. I want to look like that. Why do you think that is? Now, how do you go from something where like Bowie can just, be out like a beacon to so many young people, and then inspire an entire generation to change music, whereas some 40 years later, in the same general genre, you don't have that same sort of sticking power, that same sort of wow.
They'd have to look up from their iPhones.
Well, I don't know if that's completely true. I mean, I think, you mentioned hip hop, I think there are a lot of people who, probably look to people like, Kanye West or Drake and think, I'd like to be that. I don't know if it has, if it has the same kind of artistic or spiritual effect that Bowie had on people, but they certainly see someone who is living a life they'd like to live, and is sort of like a like a transmedia star in the case of Kanye, who is trying to do all these, trying to be like a mogul of some kind. I don't know. I mean, my daughter is intensely interested in pop music. I don't know if it's going to have the same kind of psyche moulding effect that it had on me, but she very much watches it all the time. She loves to dance. She loves to watch these videos. For her, it's an audio-visual thing. Again, it's all. She never listens to music on its own. She always watches it, and that's had an interesting effect on the way she dances, which is she only dances for an audience. The idea that you would, she dances for us to look at or her friends. She would never. The idea of dancing in a crowd, in the way that people do in disco or in rave culture that I was involved in, anonymously with no one looking at them. It's like a completely performance-oriented idea of dancing, where you're not losing yourself in a crowd. But I don't know. I'd be hesitate to write off pop music completely as a thing where people form their identities through it. I just think it has more competition. I think there are so many other things that people are excited about, whether it's games or social media or apps, or there's so many things that other things that people seem to get worked up about. Even like food seems to have this kind of rock and roll like excitement about it. Eating in unusual places, knowing about things before other people. There seems to be a lot more claims on young people's psyches in terms of what's forming their identities. There doesn't seem to be that sort of. I mean, when I grew up, people would go to war in the streets over their subcultural affiliations. It was that serious. Being into two-tone versus being into rockabilly, being into these things. They were blood would be shed over these things. Well, partly to do with clothes and partly to do with music. There seems to be less of that, but people are intensely interested in what Beyonce's done with her recent music. I don't know. I'm not sure if it's completely the case that there aren't figures on a par with a Bowie. There's something about, I think Bowie happened to that extent, and rock and roll generally, partly because everything was so culturally denuded. These people were like beacons in a sort of, in what felt like a void. And now things aren't quite as void-like for a lot of people. You feel a lot more connected to stuff that's going on through your devices. There isn't that sort of sense of cultural deprivation.
Right. Having to search for things.
Yeah.
Okay. And you speak a lot about the audio-visual component of Glam and Glitter. What did you think of the film Velvet Goldmine? Did you think Todd Haynes captured what you were trying to do in your book in hindsight?
I wasn't a massive fan of that film. I liked is Toni Collette, right? Is that her name? Who did Angie Bowie role? No, the actress who played.
Yeah, Toni Collette.
Yeah, Toni Collette. I thought she was great as Angie Bowie. I felt the central character wasn't quite charismatic enough to sort of be this figure that everyone would be fascinated by. And I felt the music just didn't really cut it, and that was really important. But it was definitely an interesting sort of essay about that time, and sort of a good attempt to sort of capture some of what Glam was about. It was very much oriented to sort of what people call like, some people call like high glam. Like it was oriented to the the Bowie, Roxy, Lou Reed, Iggy sort of axis, where it's more artistic. Whereas in this book, I kind of wanted to sort of stand up for low glam, which is like the lumpen, stomping, younger kids oriented, somewhat brainless music, like the sweet, which I think is great music, and it's fun music, but the story of how it's made and the skill that went into it and the struggles behind it makes it really interesting. Gary Glitter is a pretty, even before the terrible things he's done that have come out recently, it was a pretty strange, aberrant sort of pop folk phenomenon. And same with many of the other figures. T-Rex is a pretty strange story, and the phenomenon of T-Rexacy is really interesting. But yeah, I wasn't like a massive. Did you like it as a movie?
I did.
Yeah.
I agree that I guess in the United States, we refer to glam glitter. It was really bubblegum rock. And I wondered where the Bay City Rollers and the Bugaloos and H.R. Pufnstuf fit in with what we're talking about. Your introduction really zooms in on the appeal that these were for children.
Yeah.
Children were attracted. Obviously, they were doing something for children.
Yeah.
It all kind of came out with the gay glitter scandal that was deliberate. But, do you have a Bay City Rollers opinion about where they fit in your talking about?
The Sweet actually were sort of conceived as a bubblegum band, and then the people initially they were like meant to be like a sort of British version of the Archies, but actually real people as opposed to a cartoon. And so that record Sugar, right? That's their song. That was that was really it was like #1 for 9 weeks in England, I think. And so the people behind the Sweet were very much like, we want to do this, and they moulded this group who secretly all wanted to be Deep Purple. They wanted to be a credible hard rock band. So that's an interesting struggle in itself. You have the manipulators who want them to be the Archies, and then the band desperately trying to be Deep Purple, and the tension produces these great sort of songs that are like half rock and half pop. They really are quite great hard rock records, but they've got this shiny polish to them. But yeah, I felt there was a difference between I don't really write about David Cassidy or the Bay City Rollers or those kind of groups because I felt, or the Osmonds, because I felt like there were too many of the sort of key aspects of glam weren't really there. The absurdist look wasn't really there with David Cassidy or the Osmonds. Sexual ambiguity. I also felt like with a lot, one of the things I felt was like kind of defining of glam was almost like an emotional tenor, which is like hysteria. The Sweet songs are just, the lyric scenarios are just ludicrous scenarios just for the generation of this vibe of hysteria. Blockbuster. There's this supervillain called Buster who must be blocked, and there's Hellraiser. She's a natural born raver. Her eyes are like hysterical danger signs, flashing warnings at you. Every song is like this shrieking, crazed scenario. Teenage Rampage, Ballroom Blitz. Teenage Rampage, when the songwriters Nicky Chin and Mike Chapman, yes, thank you, presented it to the band. They said, "Here's the Nuremberg Rally," and that's even before the producer did his work with it. It's this stop. It's the kids are taking over the country. They're going to be burning things down and writing constitutions, and so it's this hysterical fantasy of the kids storming the citadels of power and taking over the country. So, a lot, Gary Glitter Records, Queen, who I think are sort of fellow travellers with glam, Sparks, so many of these groups. It's this tone of hysteria, and you don't really get that to the same extent, I don't think, with the more purely teen pop groups. Who some of them, I like some of David Cassidy's tunes, but I felt like they were kind of a bit more mild.
Sean Cassidy appears in the book, doesn't he?
Yeah. Apparently, David Cassidy's brother had this obsession with Iggy Pop and wanted to be like an Iggy Pop, and would like roll around in glass and stuff.
Sean and Patrick.
Sean. Yeah. Anyone else?
You touched on the high glam versus low glam, the art school being Roxy music, and the more yobbish Slade.
Yeah.
Was that socioeconomic divide in glam somewhat? The college students versus those who grew up in council estates and didn't.
Not in a precise way, because Brian Ferry grew up in poverty greater than what Slade did, I think, and but he went to sort of a fine art college, so he sort of I guess, embourgeoised himself through that. But Bowie is often said to have gone to art school, but he didn't. He kind of came from a sort of zone in British society that's kind of, is it upper working class, lower middle class? It's ambiguous. I don't think they're the clear cut, in terms of the band composition, I don't think the class things are that clear cut, but I suppose the targeting of the music, in a way, is more class inflected. So, you would get, Bowie was appealing to an audience who actually did value albums and the album length experience, and they weren't just all about singles. He kind of had a foot in the singles and the albums camp, and that's, I guess, a more collegiate kind of sensibility. Slade were very much like aiming for the working class audience, and for the kind of the teenagers and the working class audience that were neglected during this period of albums, and when the students took over. And then their manager said that they said their manager Chaz Chandler said there's a gap in the market that Slade have found, which is for the wage packet audience, which I'm sure it's has been the same in this country, but basically that means like people who work in a factory, they don't get money going to their bank account. They get an envelope with cash in because they don't have a bank account. They live at home with their parents. They they give half the money out of the envelope to their parents, but their mother probably, and the rest they spend on beer and records and clothes. So it's like a working class audience that Slade found that were just looking for music to go crazy to and to dance to, and that was what Slade's whole orientation was this sort of rowdy, sort of good, high-spirited, rowdy music to go mental to, and often there's quite a lot of damage at Slade concerts. There was they had to pay a bill to the promoter. They had to pay like £500 or something to the promoter because so many of the fixtures were damaged. But no one was hurt. There was no violence. It was just like high-spirited rowdiness. Yeah.
I was thinking about the way you were describing Glam, and like two groups that are American groups that are very, on one level, very glam, but rarely associated with it. Would be like Alice Cooper or Kiss, who the iconography, the sound, even, but yet whether it's the macho element or what. And I was curious if they had any crossover appeal to the British glam audience. Did they have any? Or was that just wholly separate?
Well, the Alice Cooper, I think, were actually, for a moment, they were actually bigger in Britain than in America. I mean, they had a #1 hit with Schools Out. Elected was like number 6. They were huge. And I have a whole chapter on Alice Cooper, and I think they're very much part of it.
I want to apologize, I haven't read the book yet.
All right, no, that's fine.
But nothing on Kiss.
I have a tiny bit on Kiss. I mainly, for some reason, I thought of them more as like heavy metal, or their own little movement, And they have origins. They were around the same, they came out the same scene as the New York Dolls. But I felt like there wasn't enough. There's the makeup, but it's like it's hideous makeup, isn't it? It's ghastly makeup, and it's nothing to do with like the makeup. Like Bowie was an expert at makeup. He studied with a master cosmetician, a French guy whose name I'm blanking on. But Bowie could talk at great length about the right base to use and how to apply, your mascara and how he did the thing like that. But Kiss just shoved it on with a trowel, didn't they? And it's not designed to look exquisite or androgynous. It's designed to look gross, I think, and upsetting. So I didn't feel I felt like I could get away without writing much about Kiss. But they have a link. They have a link, and I perversely have Chris appear in my book. Later in the end bit, there's a whole bit where I look at sort of the aftershocks of glam in the 80s and 90s, and I perversely have Kiss appear mainly at that moment when they take their makeup off.
Right.
And I say this is very badly timed, because that's exactly when Twisted Sister and Motley Crue are piling the makeup on, and it's like one of the worst timed decisions. Not that it affected their career, of course, they were already massive, but
And kind of tying, just to follow up on that, because you mentioned the 80s, and it does seem like the American version of glam is more with some elements of androgyny while reaffirming its heterosexuality, like loudly.
Yeah.
Like Kiss being iconic
Right.
in that sense.
Well, you talk about the hair metal bands that way too.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
Is
it's.
it American? Like, do you think there's an element of like something about Britain versus America that allows for that demands that?
Well, I think in Britain there's probably a bit more kind of camp and drag right in the mainstream of the culture. It's less of an underground culture. We had some very big mainstream stars in Britain who were on TV who were female impersonators, like Danny LaRue was like a huge star. It's a more generalised thing in British culture. It doesn't take a lot to make an Englishman put women's clothing on for all kinds of reasons. And there's loads and loads of photos of Keith Moon with women's clothing on. He had an actual compulsion to do it, more for comedy effect, I think, than actual, to look, to feel lovely and exquisite in them. But androgyny seems to be a bigger part of British culture, nearer the mainstream anyway. Whether it's the Rolling Stones were quite androgynous in their look, Oscar Wilde, the dandies of the bright young things of the 1920s, and that sort of world that Evelyn Waugh wrote about. A certain kind of gender fluidity on the part of men seems to be sort of nearer the mainstream than it was in America. So yeah, you're right. When glam becomes glam metal, becomes this thing in the 80s in America. There's tons of makeup being used and more artfully than Kiss used it, and the hair is blow dried and beautifully conditioned. But yeah, that's where it ends really. It's like the actual attitudes are quite hetero, sexist, and rampantly hetero, really. Yeah.
I'll put in a quote for Dude Looks Like a Lady by Aerosmith.
Yeah. Well, Aerosmith kind of got that, didn't they? That sort of thing they had, or at least the singer had from the Stones, didn't he? That kind of.
Well, I think it's the New York
And from the New York Dolls.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Really?
I mean,
that was the thing.
Down to the things they would tie around the
scars,
microphones.
yeah, he's definitely in that rock and roll dandy peacock kind of thing, isn't he? Steven Tyler.
Should we take one more? Then you have to sign some books,
Yeah.
don't you? This gentleman here.
Did you toy at all with going more in depth into the aftershocks? Because I think of bands like Suede and Pulp.
Yeah.
The amazing Britpop era.
They get Suede are in there. I thought with the Aftershocks, it was already quite a long book by that point. I thought poor Dean's had to.
No,
to
I
read
enjoyed
it.
I enjoyed the Aftershocks, but there's only so much you
I
can
thought
do.
what, rather than try and mention everything, I just would take things that were like. It was all like I saw it like almost like a slideshow, and you have snapshots of certain people. Like I wouldn't have everything that Susie and the Banshees did, but just key moments that related to their debts to glam and how they invented goth. A couple of things that Prince did, not the whole span of his career. Just sort of jump around, have fun with it, make it the most juicy thing. So I have like one thing on Suede where I talk about just for their first impact on the UK scene with the Drowners. I didn't bother with Pulp, as much as I love them. I love Pulp. There were certain groups that I really liked, like this group Denim, which was started by Lawrence from Felt, which is he actually worked with the Glitter Band, which is the live band Gary Glitter had. There are songs about the 70s, great hilarious songs like The Osmonds.
Yeah, that's a great song.
Middle of the Road. These brilliant sort of meta rock songs that are almost acts of rock criticism as much as they're great tunes. But I just thought I'll skip that. I'll just do Marilyn Manson in this bit. I picked the things that were the most outlandish or extreme or conceptually vivid. Lady Gaga has all these great quotes about fame, about the madness of fame, and how she wants people to be psychotic and pursue act like they're stars before they're stars. I just thought that's something I can run with thematically. Yeah, I tended not to be so interested in glam inheritors who took the substance of the sound, if you know what I mean. Like right now there's a really fun Italian group called Guida who have got the sound of the Slade and that era down pat. If you look them up on YouTube, they've got this great stompy sound, they have the boots and everything, and but the actual literal sort of revival of glam and glitter sounds I wasn't so interested in. It was more like the ideas and the provocations of that era that I kind of pursued.
All right.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks to Skylight for hosting and Dean for doing it. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
You've been listening to the Skylight Books author reading series. Don't forget, you can listen to this and all our other great podcasts at skylightbooks.com. Thanks again for stopping by, and we hope to see you soon.